we got to understand that it's a growth process, right? We can't get stressed over every single disappointment. And I'm talking about academically, behaviorally, all of that. Failures have to be considered an opportunity to grow and to get better. Me get better as a teacher, me to help my students get better. Instead of just flipping out, throwing my hands up and saying I quit, why don't we look at this as a moment for God to help us do what he called us to do, which is to make an impact in the lives of these kids that are in our classroom.
Welcome to the BJU Press Teacher Edition podcast, where Christian educators are encouraged and inspired as we bring you interviews, practical ideas, strategies, and answer your questions about teaching in today's culture. And here's your host, Jenny Copeland.
Have you ever thought, I just can't do this anymore? Or maybe I just don't want to do this anymore. Maybe that was you on your way to school this morning. Maybe you would never tell anyone and you really fight hard to not let it show, but inside you're just really struggling. Or maybe everyone around you knows and you're just burning out quickly. Teacher burnout is a real thing. And this time of year, maybe even more as the newness of the year has worn off, you're way down in the trenches with your courses. You're wading through piles of papers. You're dealing with situations with students and parents and maybe even colleagues. We say it often, teaching is a high calling, but it can be hard and lonely and exhausting as you're investing and giving every single day. Well, take heart. I think we have some encouragement for you today. Whether or not you're fighting burnout at the moment, and I'm glad if you're not, maybe you're helping someone who is, but I'm glad you're here with us today. And we really do see it as a privilege that you're taking time to tune into this episode. So just before we explore today's topic and meet today's guests, let me point you again to our website, teachereditionpodcast.com. There's some great information there. There's show notes with resources, there's information about our guests, and there's a place where you can subscribe to receive our monthly newsletter. Of course, there's also a place where you can leave questions for us. Let's start out the new year with just a stack of questions. Those are always so fun to air and to discuss on the show. So go on, take a minute and leave a question for us. You can also find us on social media. We're Teacher Edition Podcast on Facebook. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at Teacher Edition Pod. And don't forget, you can go watch these interviews on YouTube where we are Teacher Edition Podcast. So I already mentioned that we're going to talk about burnout today, and I'm really excited to have Dr. Travis Moots with us. I first crossed paths with Travis, I think a few years ago at an educator conference, and since then, I have been to many of his workshops, which, by the way, are typically packed out. So I guess I'm not the only one who really enjoys his sessions. Travis has been in education for many years. He was at Hilltop Christian School in North Carolina for 24 years. 22 years of those, he was the school principal. He has several degrees, including an educational doctorate degree from Liberty University. Currently, he is serving as the pastor at Freedom Way Church in Hubert, North Carolina. He has a sweet family, and I always enjoy the opportunity when I get to interact with Travis and his wife as our paths cross, especially in education. Travis, thank you so much for carving out some time to be with us today. I'm really excited to have you here on the show.
All right. Thank you, Jenny. Glad we were finally able to do this together. So I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. So you have a lot of experience in education and, of course, as a pastor as well. I noticed when I hear you speak, you are rarely talking academics or pedagogy. Instead, you're typically speaking on some topic about working with people or working through conflicts or situations. It's obvious those are the topics that you're really passionate about and you have a burden to share and encourage others in. But honestly, those aren't easy topics at all. And teacher burnout is definitely a tricky topic. We're teachers. We're supposed to be on top of it, right? We're called to impact the next generation, be flexible, be problem solvers, collaborators, learners, all of that. That's just the start of the list. But in all honesty, we're tired. Maybe exhausted would be a better word for that. We're always running tight on time. We're boggled working with people sometimes. We're stressed. And sometimes we even just wonder, is it worth it all? We've all had those times where we've thought that. Talk with us about that. Is it really worth it? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I certainly hope it's worth it, but I can tell you there's a lot of teachers who are wondering. They're asking themselves that question, unfortunately.
Exactly.
I do enjoy talking a lot about these type of issues. mainly because pedagogy puts people to sleep. We are human beings, and teachers are human. We have emotions, and that is part of being a teacher. That's part of handling the day in and day out duties of teaching. And I think everybody's aware of the fact that there is a teacher shortage across America.
Right.
I'm not sure if it's worse in the public sector or Christian schools, but there is a teaching shortage. And I'm going to point to one study that the RAND Corporation did. They asked professionals, is it worth the stress? Is what you do worth the stress? Well, among all college educated workers in general, 6 out of 10 said, yes, it's worth the stress of this job. 4 out of 10 teachers said it was worth the stress. That means this was a pretty broad sampling of people, but that means there's a lot of teachers, maybe most teachers, that are struggling with this issue. And they're saying, I don't know if it is worth all of the stress. And that is no doubt one of the reasons why we have such a big shortage of teachers. Just a quick example is a couple years ago, the education district in Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, they started the school year with 293 teachers short. The year before that, they started 500 teachers short. This is a problem. Wow. This is a big problem. I do not think the problem is as big in the Christian school sector as it is in the public school sector, but it is definitely something that teachers are having to deal with. Burnout is a problem. And so I think we can talk about some ways to help teachers with that.
Okay, so you mentioned burnout. The term teacher burnout is definitely a buzzword. I think especially since COVID, as we've seen teachers, like you said, there's walking away from education, by the hundreds. We've heard those reports. And of course, a study like that just shows how we have all those openings sitting. And I'm sure that's just representative of the whole nation. There is a lot that gets stuffed into that term burnout, though. I'm just burned out, people say. What do you think is the actual problem?
Yes. So it is an overused term, I'm convinced, a term that we tend to use for every time we have a problem. But if we're talking about it in terms of stress, teacher stress, then it is a very real thing. It is a very real problem. I'll give you just a few common stressors for teachers. And this is from my experience of researching this, as well as just my own experience working and talking to other educators. Classroom discipline is a big one for teachers. A lot of teachers are burned out because of classroom discipline. Now, I do think that's a bigger problem in public schools than it is Christian schools, but even still, behavior management, classroom management, rather, that's a big issue for a lot of teachers. And if they've not been able to really learn how to do that well, that'll stress you out in a heartbeat. You don't want to show up the next day because the kids rule how will we say, the inmates are running the asylum. And that's how you feel if you haven't learned how to manage the classroom. And then conflict with parents is a really big issue that burns a lot of teachers out. They haven't learned how to deal with that, or they just have some really, really difficult parents. Now, I'm one of those folks that I'm not quick to throw parents under the bus. I think our Christian school parents are good people. I think 99 out of 100 have their kids in Christian school for the right reasons. But people are still people. And
That's exactly.
And we have to learn how to deal with that. So a lot of it also has to do with expectations. And yes, maybe the school's expectations, the parents' expectations on the teacher, even the administrator's expectations on the teacher. But a lot of us place more expectations on ourselves than anybody else does. And that can add to stress as well. You've got some schools, and I wish it weren't this way, but they just do not have a good working environment. And that's, the onus is on the administrators and school leaders on that. But that's why school leaders have to work hard to make sure that it is a good working environment in their school, a good place to be employed, plenty of support. And then sometimes just good old fashioned workload. I mean, it's just, you're expected to do a lot in one day.
That's right.
And
Christian school,
yes,
cover a lot of duties.
And it's not always what you got your degree in.
That's right.
Some would say it has nothing to do with what I got my degree in. So there's a lot of different things, but yes, burnout is real, but I'm talking about it definitely in terms of teacher stress and real stress that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. I would put it this way. Burnout, it's when you're running on empty. You're running on empty. I mean, the car won't go anymore. And it doesn't matter how much you want to do what you're doing. It doesn't matter how much you love your kids, you love your job to a degree, and you're stressed out, but you're on empty and you can't go on empty. And then what happens is little things start stressing you out. Let me just throw out some typical symptoms of stress. They apply to teachers as well sometimes. Fatigue. You can't sleep, or you can't seem to get enough sleep. Let's put it that way. Now, teaching is tiring. So if you expect to be 100% by 3:00 in the afternoon, you got the wrong job. But you're going to be tired. And then you start just getting pains and physical pains and different problems. And you go to the doctor, and the doctor runs the tests, and we get frustrated when the doctor says, there's no good reason, it's just stress. And we get frustrated with that because we want a med or we want a diagnosis. And a lot of times the doctor's right. It really is stress. And then when we are dealing with a lot of stress, one of the symptoms is every little thing just sends us over the edge. So the principal said, hey, I got a teacher who's got tomorrow off. I need you to do sidewalk duty for him. And we flip out. And something that small we should not flip out because we have to do an extra something for 30 minutes on one day, but it's because we have already built up so much stress. And sometimes it's even coming from outside the classroom. It's coming off campus. And you can't, as a person, we're human. As a person, you can't just go to school, and you can compartmentalize a little bit. And we can say a little bit, I'm going to get busy with the things of the day, and we do. And we forget about whatever it is, the family problems or the financial worries or whatever it is. Loved ones are sick and things like that. We can compartmentalize a little bit, but there's a point where all of that is building up, and it takes a toll on us mentally and even sometimes physically as well. And so you've got all that tension inside of you. And then the principal says, I need you to stay 30 minutes after school and help us with carpool. Or that parent that already rubs you the wrong way just sends the wrong email on the wrong day. And we just can't handle it. And that's a sign of we're too stressed. And that's when burnout does happen. Now, if you're looking for a stress-free job, don't go into teaching. We're not saying it's stress-free. And to be honest, a little bit of stress is actually good. Because are you really doing something that changes lives if it's stress-free? You're not. And so I don't know of anybody who chose teaching because they thought it was easy or they make a lot of money. We want to change lives. And that's
one I didn't know much about.
That's one of the reasons I love Christian school teachers is because they're all in it for the right reasons. But we're human. And we have our limitations.
Yeah, absolutely. So likely most of us have gone to the doctor or sat down with a family member or friend, like you kind of alluded to, and had them tell us that we just need to lessen our stress. Well, we know, like you said, that's a pretty easy statement to make, but seeing that through can be a whole other story. So I guess maybe we could just not have class for a few days. Maybe that's what we need to do. Or maybe just not answering parent email. I'm not really sure how to do this. There's just a no-go on any of those suggestions. What suggestions do you have? So you've talked about what it is. You talked about some of the symptoms. How do you suggest teachers manage them?
Yes, absolutely. Let's offer some suggestions because teaching is going to be stressful to some degree, but we need to get you to the point where you're not sneaking to your car at lunchtime and crying your eyeballs out. Or every afternoon on your way home, you're not rehearsing your resignation speech. Yes. Exactly. So I'll throw some out. All right. So how can we manage teacher stress? Let's start with having proper boundaries. Let's create proper boundaries and let's respect those boundaries. So there's a time when the job starts and there's a time when the job ends. Now I get it. You're looking at somebody who takes their work home. And there are going to be those nights where you're grading papers late at night. That's going to happen. That cannot happen all the time, though. And people's boundaries are going to be a little different. What works for you, what works for your family. Your family not only needs you, you need your family.
Right.
And if you don't have a family, not only do your friends need you, you need your friends. We have to have some boundaries. You also need to exercise. And I'm not going to preach that because the last 3 weeks have actually been pretty bad for me in that. But we just get out and walk the neighborhood. We need to do some of these things that, honestly, it's how God created us to function. People, family, exercise. And what we have to learn to do is just tell people no. And that's not easy for some people to do. And say no, or tomorrow. I can help you with that tomorrow, or we need to pick that up next week. So we need to create boundaries that work for us, and they do need to be realistic. But if we don't have them, we're going to keep stressing ourselves out. We're going to keep running on empty. That brings me to emphasizing that we have limitations. You ever heard of the 85% rule? So don't ever book yourself at 100%. Book yourself at 85%. And you might not make it to 100 if you do. But
right.
we have to learn to use different time management resources. All of these could be a discussion all on their own. But I'm just throwing out some ideas here. But part of this does begin with beliefs. I mean, you have to understand and believe that you have limitations, that you can't do everything. And if you're good at what you do, people are going to ask, and they're going to keep asking. But you have to keep in mind that you have limitations for yourself, for your family, others who need you as well. But part of that, too, I mentioned earlier about expectations. I want to say a word about perfectionism. All right. So resist perfectionism. And some of us are perfectionists. Probably hardly anybody's a perfectionist at everything, but we are perfectionists at certain things. And teachers tend to be perfectionists about certain things in the classroom. And it's good to have high standards. Good teachers have high standards. I get that. We need to have high standards. But we can't be a perfectionist. Ask yourself the question, is it really worth it? Is it really worth it that I spend another hour decorating this wall in my classroom? Sometimes good enough is good enough. And that sounds bad to some people, like, oh, you don't have high standards. No, you do have high standards. But sometimes it just has to be good enough because, for one, I can't run on empty. And secondly,
it's a balance.
My time needs to be on something else. And I can't make everything perfect. And I know not everybody battles that, but some people battle that. They have to be a perfectionist about everything. And we also have to be careful that we're not a perfectionist with our students either, because that begins to affect relationships. Because then we're the cranky teacher. We're the unrealistic teacher. And, when you start having people problems, well, that just amps up stress even more. On another note, let's talk about how we need to rejuvenate. And that's going to be different for different people. We can't give ourselves fully to our students or other people in our lives if we don't learn how to rest. Some of that is going to be consistent across the board with all human beings. Is how God made us. You got to get enough sleep at night. Different people have different ways of getting from empty back to full. And we have to figure that out. And it may be different if you introvert, extrovert. But some people need people a little bit more. Some people need to rest a little bit more. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the mindfulness movement. And a lot of folks, okay. Yeah. Well, let me tell you something that beats mindfulness. Prayerful meditation.
Absolutely.
Nothing beats it. And I'm not going to start preaching now. But
that's okay.
I'm telling you, nothing beats that. Nothing beats finding time alone and just talking to God about His Word and about what's going on in your classroom and in your life and in your job. So all that is exercise, yes. Meditating on Scripture, yes. All of that. We have to prioritize rejuvenating. I know that's easy to say, but we get in these certain weeks, these certain times of the school year. deadlines, kids, extracurriculars, when we're running on empty, let's don't go to the car and cry at lunchtime. Let's try to do some things to rejuvenate. Let's say a word about our attitude, because attitude does have something to do with this. We've got to,
Absolutely.
yes, we've got to learn to replace a defensive spirit with a teachable spirit. Mistakes are not the end of the world. As a matter of fact, I have here, I have some notes in front of me. I have a quote from Henry Blackaby. You might be familiar with his writings. This is what he said: covering up or refusing to accept responsibility for failure is a character issue. Making a mistake is not. We're human. We're going to make mistakes. But when we cover that up, when we get defensive, instead of learning from that, well, that's just going to make the stress even worse. And the stress wouldn't be as high if we would understand that mistakes are just human and they're not all a character flaw. And even if there is a character flaw, there is such thing as repentance, forgiveness, and spiritual growth. So let's not go overboard when we get criticism. Teachers have to have thick skin. You just have to. You have to. That doesn't mean we have to be willing to take junk, but we have to be willing to take some criticism, because we're going to make mistakes. And sometimes it's not always that I did something wrong. It's just I'm not good enough. I got a student who's failing, or I've got a student who may not be failing, but is not doing as well as they need to be doing. And I've got to do more to help that student. Let's use this as a teachable moment instead of taking criticism too hard. And I think with that, we also have to remember that student growth, since we're talking about students and helping them and the stress involved in that, we got to understand that it's a growth process, right? We can't get stressed over every single disappointment. And I'm talking about academically, behaviorally, all of that. Failures have to be considered an opportunity to grow and to get better. Me get better as a teacher, me to help my students get better. Instead of just flipping out, throwing my hands up and saying I quit, why don't we look at this as a moment for God to help us do what he called us to do, which is to make an impact in the lives of these kids that are in our classroom. It might be helping them grow in their character and their behavior. It might be helping them figure out how to memorize all that stuff on the history test, or figure out how to do that math problem. But let's take the stress, let's take the criticism, let's take the failure and use that as a growing moment and a teaching moment. And remember that it's a process. They're not going to go from being a D student to an A student in a week. It's a process. And no kid is going to go from being the kind of kid who gets up out of their seat, runs around the classroom, and hits the other kids upside the head with their lunchbox, to being student of the week, not in 1 week. And so I'm not telling us to not have standards. Let's have standards. We can't grow if we don't have standards. We can help kids grow if we don't have standards, but it's a process. And so if we're going to be a perfectionist, if we're going to have unrealistic expectations about the growth process, then we definitely are going to be burned out real fast.
Yeah. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I think you hit the nail on the head, because so many of us as educators who are very driven, we want things to be great. We push hard. We don't say no. We just keep going. And you can definitely see how that stress just builds and builds and builds. And like, I like what you said, we need to view failures as an opportunity to grow. We're not perfect. We're pushing hard. We're doing our very best, but we're not perfect. And either we need to grow, like you said, sometimes we're just not doing enough, or we need to do differently, and not seeing that as a failure and adding that stress, but taking it as an opportunity. Keep growing. So as we drill down more on stress, since we're talking that way, we obviously have a deep tie between spiritual, emotional maturity and handling that stress. And I think you touched here a little bit, but let's take it a step further. What would you say are some symptoms of emotional deficiency?
So again, that goes back to attitude a little bit, and the way we, our belief about some things. So I'm going to use the term ministry. It's a job, but it's a ministry. Are we using God and ministry to please ourselves? And if we are, then we're not looking at this the correct way. Couple examples. We believe in truths in God's word. Well, are we using those truths to judge other people, find flaws in everybody else? Or are we using those truths to help us become better servants of Christ? Are we using our Bible knowledge to justify our sins, get a little too intellectual, too intellectual for our own good, and we can figure out how to justify bad behaviors or bad thinking, rather than to use those truths to become a more healthy person spiritually? When we're unhealthy emotionally and spiritually, we also begin to ignore our emotions. We ignore the anxiety. We ignore the fear. We cannot ignore those things. There's different reasons why people are tempted to ignore those things. But understanding that you're dealing with fear, understanding that you're dealing with anxiety, that is part of being a human. And we can't improve what we refuse to recognize.
Yeah.
And
But we don't know.
yes, and the reason you have to recognize it is because you can't fix the source of your fear if we're just covering it up. So
Right.
we're covering it up when we do things like bite people's heads off, treat them, cruelly. When we explain it away, there's all different sorts of ways of covering that up. And we can even begin to ignore harmful patterns in our past. And so what happens is, instead of being what God wants us to be, we're just doing what God wants us to do. And we need to learn how to live in the presence of God. We have to learn how to worship. We have to learn how to think about God in the right way. There's just some different ways to identify whether or not we're emotionally unhealthy. But what we have to learn to do is actually learn to know ourselves a little bit more. And that can sound, if you don't have a biblical view of that, that can sound very self-centered.
Absolutely. But
It really can. But we have to break free of false ideas about, let's go back to what we were saying earlier about rest and exercise. That's not a sin. That's not a sin. That's how we need to understand how God created us. I mentioned we need people. That's how God created us, and people need us. So we need to realize what it means to actually be God's human creation. We have feelings, we have perspectives, and so therefore we need to be spirit-led in all of that. And so we'll become more mature as a person in our attitude and in our emotions, if we'll understand exactly how God created us as human beings.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then nothing replaces the biblical concept of growing emotionally by waiting on God. Now that's where we do get a little bit more preachy, but we have to learn how to wait on God, and it's not fun. And again, it's easier said than done. I understand that, but we have to learn how to wait. We want our problems solved right now, but we also want them solved the way we want them solved. But whatever is going on in the classroom or on our school campus that is stressing us out, I think we have to remember that God is not oblivious to the fact that we are on that school campus. He got us there. He let us get there. He let us get in that mess. Doesn't mean God wants people to sin, but God knew a problem was going to occur, and God let us get in the middle of that problem. God has a plan for that problem. And this is why we have to learn how to wait on God. And I think one of the best ways we grow by waiting on God is to grow by submitting to his choices. Let's take Elijah as an example, who just prayed down fire from heaven, slayed 450 prophets of Baal, and we would all say he was successful, right? And then he gets this little note from Jezebel, and Jezebel's going to kill him. And next thing you know, he's asking God to take his life. Of course, God sent an angel and refreshed him. But it comes down to the fact that Elijah had to submit to what God was doing in his personal life as well as in his surroundings. And Elijah was disappointed. He was depressed because God didn't handle the situation the way Elijah wanted him to. And that's what leads to a lot of our stress, especially if we have a stressful life in general, is we are very disappointed that God is not doing things the way we want God to do things. He's not taking problems away, or he's not solving problems, or whatever. Right? And it's different for different people. Everybody's situation is a little different. One more example is Job. Do you remember in Job chapter 13 when Job sued God? I'm so glad that was put in the Bible. And he did it in the most respectful way you possibly could. But he said, enough is enough. I don't have to review everything bad that happened to Job. And he did it very respectful and said, God, basically, I'm going to sue you because I want answers, but please don't terrify me. Please don't pounce on me. I just want answers. And so he asked God these questions. And what did God do? God asked him 66 questions that he couldn't answer.
Yeah.
And what was the point? The point was, you don't always know the ways of God. We can't know all the ways of God because we're not God. And Job, he had to become broken in order to get over his stress. And he said, well, he was already broken. He was broken. As a matter of fact, because his problems weren't a result of his sin. That's why he's such a great example in the Bible of how to deal with stress and emotional issues when we're going through problems. It wasn't because of his sin, but he had to become broken as far as dealing with his pride about, God, why haven't you done this? Why are you doing that? And once he got there, then the blessing started. That's when he really started dealing with the stress properly, was when he was broken before God.
Yeah. Very impacting thoughts. Love how you said the question kind of at the beginning here, you asked, are we using God in ministry to please ourselves? And it ties back in that we have a plan, and educators typically have a plan. And sometimes our plan can get in the way and be causing our stress because we're not willing to just hand it over to the Lord. Excellent. Right. Okay. So as we wrap up this episode, what would you say to the listener who is hearing what you're saying and even knows that he or she needs to do something about this burnout or the stress? What advice would you give them for becoming, I guess as you say it, more resilient and honestly connecting back to what you shared, more spiritually, emotionally healthy? Where should they start?
So how do we begin by becoming more resilient? Well, the first thing we do is spiritual. I guess it's all spiritual. A biblical worldview doesn't separate the spiritual from the everyday things, but let's first talk about spiritually. The first thing we have to do is give the situation to the Lord. Does that sound real profound?
Right.
But here's why. Because what we're doing by doing that is we are realizing that I am a educator dealing with these problems because God put me here. He has a plan, and there's something he wants me to do for him in this situation. So really, it has to start in our heart. It has to. But then I think we need to do some serious inventory of our time, of what we're doing with our time, how we're managing our time. And that involves people. We need to manage what are we doing to not just get things done, but what am I doing to rejuvenate? What am I doing in order to help me deal with stress? Because I need to understand that this teaching is a stressful profession, period. So how am I dealing with my time? And then I would say a third thing that comes to mind is, how am I dealing with the people who are stressing me out the most? I could give a couple examples. Let's talk about parents, not because they're bad, but there's a lot of teachers who have not quite got to the point where they see parents as a resource, but they see parents as a stressor. So learn how to communicate with them. You have to have boundaries. You have to tell them this is how we need to communicate. And so what you don't answer texts at 10 o'clock at night. because you have laid out a good plan for you. You are a good communicator. You will communicate with them, and you've told them how to communicate with you. So that's one thing when it comes to parents. If there are relationships on the school campus with coworkers that are not good, do not ignore that. Follow the biblical steps. Employ the services of a school leader. But people problems with parents, other coworkers, and then of course if you're bringing baggage from your marriage, marital stress, children, get help. God did not create us to deal with life on our own. Get the help you need, get the advice you need, get the counseling you need, because it will affect you. At some point, it's going to affect you, and it's going to affect your students. It's going to start affecting students in ways you don't even realize, because you're not really examining the source of the stress in your own mind.
Yeah, that's great. So again, giving it to God, doing an inventory of our time, and then working with people. Don't just let those relationships, boil or whatever they're doing. Get in there, work on them, and communicate well. I appreciate the boundaries too. You can still be a helpful, wonderful teacher with correct boundaries. Like you said, not responding to texts at 10 o'clock at night. They will be there in the morning. You can get your rest. So I appreciate all those. Just so practical. Thank you so much for the encouragement and really the challenge that you brought to the table today. Stress and burnout are real. We've said that multiple times, even today on this episode. And no doubt there's more than one listener who's with us today who's dealing with this right now. And I appreciate you challenging us in our calling as educators, but also in our walk as children of God, really. And so it's been a great blessing having you on the show. Thanks so much for your time.
All right. Thank you, Jenny. I love Christian school teachers. We need them, and we need to empower them and help them because our students need them. So it's a pleasure. Thank you.
We're true. Thank you. And thank you for what you've done today. Listeners, whether you are struggling today or maybe you're teaching along someone who is struggling in this area, I hope you found something that you can take away from this episode to encourage you. What a high calling God has given you in giving you the opportunity to impact young lives every single day. Be encouraged. Stay the course. The Lord promises to give you exactly what you need today and every day. If He called you to this, He's going to provide everything you need. As we sign off for today, just a reminder to go to teachereditionpodcast.com to learn more about the show and to submit questions for our upcoming episodes. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Now, once again, it's time to get back to your day. But it's not just any day. Every day in the classroom is your day to impact and inspire through God's power and also through His grace working in you. Now, be encouraged and go do what God has called you to do.